Evidence, need evidence. You before, let's go. Hello. All good? Yes. I'm right. Listen, I'm only going to Canada for you today, but I can't find a propulsion.
So it's next Monday, isn't it? I thought, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's next Monday. Okay, cool. No, I found a crew call sheet for the 28th, the Good Liar or something. Okay, cool. Thank you.
I had only one day off.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah. I am. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Bye. Bye.
We're going on the stairs down.
So is that the house?
I believe it is.
Yeah.
pupil has declined year. And if we look at the numbers from the latest figures, which I believe are 1st of July 2019, the Army has 74,440 against a target 82,000, the RAF 29,930 against a target 31,750, and the Royal Navy Marines 29,090 against a target of 30,450. I mean, what's the government going to do to address the shortfall?
Minister.
Well, I think we're doing a lot, actually. And as I've just said, we only need to look at this year, where all the signs are very positive. The real challenge we faced recently has been in the other ranks within the Army. Our officer entrants are full, as indeed the Army Reserve is growing. But if I just focus momentarily on the other ranks within the Army, the target this year is 9,404. We have already achieved 70% of that target in the first 6 months. The second we get to 80%, that means that the Army numbers, assuming outflow remains constant, will remain the same and will not reduce. And every single other rank we manage to recruit over 80% will actually show an increase in Army numbers. So within the first 6 months, we've already done 70%. We have 10% more to do within the next 6 months to maintain numbers. Every one after that will represent an increase in Army numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask my right honourable friend what progress the Army has made to getting female soldiers into frontline units such as rifle platoons in an infantry battalion?
Minister. Well, I'm very proud that there are now no roles in the British Army which are not open to women, so all ground close combat roles are open. We have seen the first women join the Royal Armoured Corps. We do now also have women in training to join the infantry. I can't give my honourable friend an exact number, but I will write to him with that detail.
Chairman.
Is the Secretary of State aware that in 1982, at the time of the Falklands conflict, we had 327,000 people in the armed services. Now we believe below 100,000. Isn't it the fact that if Mr. Putin came steaming towards us tomorrow, we wouldn't be able to defend this country?
No, that's certainly not the case. I mean, certainly it is true, to quote Stalin, that quantity has a quality all of its own. However, the modern armed forces are very different to those of the 1980s. You only need to look at the Queen Elizabeth, our new carrier, which, compared to Ark Royal, her predecessor, has got a complement which requires just 1/4 of the number of the crew.
Mr. Speaker, Kent is proud to host a number of Gurkhas across the county, including in the Queen's Gurkha Engineers, currently located at Invicta Park Barracks, just outside of my constituency. So will my honourable friend join me in welcoming the number of personnel in the Brigade of Gurkhas, which has increased by 25% in the last 4 years?
Well, I have to declare my interest, Mr. Speaker. The first Army unit I joined were the Queen's Gurkha Engineers back in 1988 in Hong Kong, and I'm delighted that off the top of my head we currently have 69 and 70 Gurkha Field Squadrons serving in Victor Barracks in Maidstone. But I am also pleased to be able to announce that the aspiration is to create 6-7 Squadron from 2021, and indeed a further second Gurkha Engineer Squadron, 6-8 Squadron from 2023. So the Brigade of Gurkhas continues to grow.
Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know about the government's disastrous record on recruitment of UK personnel, with the fully trained size of the Army, as we've already heard, having now just fallen to 74,000 personnel. But they're also failing to recruit enough Commonwealth troops too. And we now hear that the government's cancelling plans to proactively recruit from overseas. So can the Minister explain how this decision guarantees sufficient recruitment to our armed forces, and how on earth he plans to meet the stated target of 82,000 soldiers?
Minister.
Well, I've already explained part of what we're doing. I sense that the Honourable Gentleman wrote his question before listening to my answers and hasn't been able to adapt it, which is a shame, but often the case in this House. Equally, I think he's fallen into the trap of reading a Daily Express or Sunday Express article, which is factually not the case. We've always recruited from the Commonwealth, and over the last 2 years we are increasing our recruitment from the Commonwealth.
Mr. David Davis.
Well, I have listened to the Minister's answers, and he intimated that we were replacing quantity with quality. Much of this problem goes back to the capita contract for recruiting the soldiers and sailors and airmen. And that was massively criticised in a Public Accounts Committee report earlier this year, both in terms of quantity and quality. And today, we have 10% of our troops incapable of deployment abroad because of medical reasons. Can you tell us what you can do to fix those problems?
Minister. There is no doubt. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. The House is absolutely right to scrutinise this government over recruiting into our armed forces. And I welcome that because that enables me to be able to put pressure on our service chiefs. But I have explained, actually, whilst there were without doubt challenges to that capital contract, I've demonstrated already today how within this year itself we have already reached 70% of our target within the first 6 months. So that contract is now performing in a way that it wasn't before. And when it comes to medical standards, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, which is why there's a series of reviews at the moment about how we can prevent those injuries happening in the first place.
Mr. Speaker. Hey, Minister Ben Wallace.
Mr. Speaker, happy Trafalgar Day. Mr. Speaker, with permission, may I group together question 2 and 22? Ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz are currently exposed to the threat of being harried by units of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and in some cases illegal seizure. While the international community is working to de-escalate tensions, up to 4 ships of the Royal Navy have been active in the Strait since July.
Mr. John Barron.
Mr. Speaker, no matter how capable, a Royal Navy ship cannot be in 2 places at once. Is it not obvious that on this anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar, and given that 95% of our trade is sea-borne, it is obvious we need a much larger surface fleet, and within that, perhaps a larger number of cheaper ships if we are to play our full part in keeping world sea lanes open.
We're grateful.
I agree strongly with my honourable friend's point, which is why this government has invested in the new Type 26 frigate, but also the Type 31, which will be designed to be more affordable, that will increase our overall size of our frigates and destroyers able to deploy. But it is also the case that in this example, very quickly we managed to have 4 ships in that region at first to tackle that problem, and we have now gone back down to supplying 2 there, but it wasn't the case that we couldn't get ships in the right place at the right time.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his answers thus far. Clearly, the IRGC is a constant threat to shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. Does he not agree with me that it is now time that the entirety of the IRGC was prescribed, their assets sequestered, and indeed sanctions imposed on them and their leadership?
My honourable friend makes an important point about the threat that the IRGC is posing, not just to the region, but also to countries like ourselves. It is the fact that the Quds Force is currently prescribed. Further prescription considerations are a matter for the Home Office. However, what is really important is that where they pose a threat, like-minded countries around the world challenge that threat and make sure they are dealt with.
Stephen Pound.
Trafalgar Day has been mentioned, and later today when Up Spirits is piped, and we all, I hope, drink a tot to the immortal memory. I hope that the Minister will place on record his recognition and understanding that the Royal Naval and Royal Marine personnel currently on active service represent the very finest tradition of our services. Let's put that on the record.
I'm of course delighted to agree with the honourable member about the amazing quality that they bring to our armed forces. I am a landlubber as a former soldier, so I can only marvel at what I have come across so far in this job.
Dear Griffith.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, happy Trafalgar Day. And yesterday I had the pleasure of seeing the Sea Cadets parade in an extremely splendid fashion for Trafalgar Day. Can I first welcome the Secretary of State and the new ministers to their posts. Now, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and the wider Gulf has significantly escalated in the past few months. We've seen unlawful aggression in the international seas, British-flagged ships seized by the Iranian regime, attacks on Saudi oil facilities, and a recent commitment by the US to send an extra 3,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to de-escalate tensions. So with that in mind, can the Secretary of State confirm that the UK will not be sending troops to Saudi Arabia?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right that we have to de-escalate this situation in the Gulf.
What we will, however, do is make sure that our allies in the Gulf are able to protect themselves by offering advice about how they can protect their airspace and protect from loss of life. And I think that's incredibly important, that one of the ways to make sure this is de-escalated, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that if there was another Iranian attack, for example, on an oil facility or any other facility in that part of the world, that it did not lead to loss of life, because I think that for sure would lead to some form of escalation. We stand ready to help our allies with knowledge and how to do that, and that is the best way we think we can proceed to keep the tensions calmer.
Neil Griffith.
I thank the Secretary of State for his answer. But, Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will also be well aware of the catastrophic impact of the US withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal. Sadly, this is not the only commitment that the Trump administration has very publicly undermined, withdrawing from the INF Treaty and putting the chances of a New START treaty in doubt. So what discussions has the Secretary of State had with his US counterparts on upholding and strengthening existing international security agreements?
On the JCPO, with dealing with Iranian nuclear capability, I have made clear, as have my other colleagues in Europe, to the United States, that we support the maintenance of that agreement. We think that is the best way forward to make sure that both Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon, but also deals with the concerns that the Iranians have had over years about their security. And we will continue to press that, as we continue to press in the areas of Turkey and Syria around the upholding of international law and human rights obligations.
The good doctor and the illustrious chair of the Select Committee on Defence, Dr. Julian Lewis.
I hope I get an extra long question in the light of that introduction, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity for the first time to congratulate my right honourable friend on becoming Secretary of State for Defence, and may I return to the question of the tanker seizures and the point made by my honourable friend for Basildon and Billericay. Doesn't the fact that it was originally conceived that 32 frigates and destroyers would be necessary to complement the carrier strike forces and the amphibious forces mean that at 19 frigates and destroyers, the size of the escort fleet is woefully too small?
Minister.
I look forward to working with my honourable friend. I think I'm in front of his committee later in the week, which will, no doubt, I shall bow to his knowledge, as he no doubt will grill me. Look, I understand the point that is made. All our defence capabilities have to match our ambitions. I think that is the first point across the board, whether that's land, sea or air. What is the case is that our fleet, our surface fleet, is over 50. Of course, 19 will be frigates and destroyers. And that means we do allow flexibility in our fleet to meet certain needs, such as disaster relief was done by a Royal Fleet Auxiliary ship. If, however, the threat changes, we must always be prepared to move to match that threat. We will always keep under review the size of our fleet, but it is also why we continue to invest in new ships, more capable sometimes in numbers because of the very potency they pose. The Type 26 frigate itself will be a world-leading capability, and that in itself will be a deterrent to many of our adversaries.
Andrew Jones.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Lancaster.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take questions 3, 4, 5, 21 and 24 together. We remain committed to maintaining the overall size of the armed forces, and we have a range of measures underway to improve recruitment and retention. Those measures are kept under constant review. Importantly, the services continue to meet all their current operational commitments, keeping the country and its interests safe.
And Joan.
The Harrogate and Knaresborough constituency is proud home to the Army Foundation College, which has 1,100 junior soldiers in training. Last year, the college received an outstanding classification from Ofsted. Does my right honourable friend agree that the educational excellence on offer is a key part of the recruitment package for the college, and that the qualifications the junior soldiers receive set them up just not for their careers in the army, but for the whole of their lives?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for being such a champion of this outstanding college, and he is absolutely correct. There's a multitude of excellent opportunities of which Defence and the Army are extremely proud, and these are reflected not just in terms of formal qualifications and apprenticeships, but also the self-esteem, confidence and leadership skills that they gain.
Alphon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In Harlow, we have outstanding cadet forces and outstanding cadet leadership. They provide the training that young people need and develop qualities of leadership. Can I ask my right honourable friend, what more can we be doing to support our cadet forces in Harlow and elsewhere to encourage young people into the services? And will he come and visit one of our great Harlow cadet forces?
Well, of course, how can I resist such a kind invitation? I'd be delighted to come and visit. Indeed, I started life as a cadet, so I know the value of it. But in accordance with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, they are not conduits for entry into the armed forces. However, it is a fact that whilst just 4% of our cadet forces join the armed forces, some 20% of our armed forces were once a cadet.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our cadet organisations give young people an invaluable insight into the potential of a future career in the armed forces, but they do need places to meet. I understand the MOD will help give financial support to buildings and other facilities for the Army and Air Cadets, but not to the Sea Cadets. So given that today is Trafalgar Day, will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can help to raise money for a new home for Chelmsford's excellent Sea Cadets?
Well, training ship Upholder in Chelmsford is indeed an excellent base for the Chelmsford Sea Cadets, and it is right that the Sea Cadets have a different funding formula than the other two services. They receive both a mix of funding from the MOD but also from other sources as well, and each of the Sea Cadet units is an individual charity. There's been much debate over the years as to whether or not that is the right way to move forward, but I'd be delighted to meet my honourable friend.
Sir Robert Sim.
The MOD in the past has done a number of bespoke packages to recruit people whose skills they need. For example, qualified doctors when the medical services have been short. Does the MOD intend to do more bespoke packages to get those with a range of skills into the armed services?
Well, my honourable friend raises a really interesting point, how as we move forward with the different specialist skill sets that we do need, for example, cyber is just one example, as well as medical services, as to whether or not we need to look at different models about how they can join the armed forces. And one of the areas that we are looking at is both greater use of the reserves, these specialist skills, but equally whether or not we should be having some form of lateral entry, as we already do with medical services.
How's Watling?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the last 2 years, I've been honoured to be part of the wonderful Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. I graduated only last week. Now, I've visited all three services, and they're engaging people doing amazing work to keep the peace and keep us safe. Overwhelmingly, they get great satisfaction and lead interesting lives. But I was shocked to hear that some universities are resistant to these terrific people visiting and advertising this unique career path to students. So I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, what more can be done to get our young people engaged with an armed forces career?
Of State.
Well, I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's comments about the Armed Forces Parliamentary Trust. Indeed, it's a scheme which many honourable and right honourable members in this House have benefited from. When it comes to young people, we are, of course, already the largest provider of apprenticeships in the UK, but also when it comes to encouraging university students to join, we have a birthship scheme, we have an undergraduate scheme. There's also, of course, the University Officer Training Corps and indeed the University Air Squadrons and University Royal Naval units where undergraduates can participate.
Emma Dent Code.
Speaker, my question relates to the quality of living accommodation and local facilities on offer that make an army family life attractive. Could the Minister please update the House on the new £125 million leisure complex at Faslane Nuclear Base, dubbed the Super Mess, currently being dismantled to remove combustible materials?
Minister.
I think it's of note that it's normally family pressures which are the #1 reason why which members of the armed forces cite for leaving the armed forces, and that's why it's absolutely right that we do get this whole package correct. Faslane, as the honourable lady knows, will soon be the home of the entire submarine force for the Royal Navy. It has been the subject to a large amount of investment and has some of the best accommodation in the armed forces, but the mess itself has had challenges, and I will happily write to the honourable lady to update you exactly where we are on that issue.
The respected and celebrated President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Mrs Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During visits with the NATO PA and indeed the Defence Select Committee to Finland, Norway and Sweden, I've noted their highly selective and competitive attempt to recruit young people into a national service scheme, into the armed forces and government defence agencies. This is much sought after schemes in all countries and is highly effective at not only recruiting young people but retaining them into the reserves. Can I ask the Minister to look at Elizabeth Braw's excellent article on this in the Russi Journal, and can he look at this as an exemplar for the UK?
Well, Madam President, I'm grateful to your words of advice, and indeed I think it's a very constructive suggestion. I'm more than happy at looking at any way that we can encourage more people to join the armed forces, and crucially on the other side of the coin, which is to stay in the armed forces.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Traditionally, the North East provides a higher proportion of armed services personnel than any other region in England. Could the Minister confirm whether this is still the case following the recruitment shambles, and also set out the improvements to pay and housing that he will make so that the sacrifices of our armed forces are in the interest of the country and not of austerity?
Well, the Honourable Lady rightly highlights the important contribution that both the North East and the North West have made to recruiting to all three services over many years. I think equally it's fair to recognise that I'm determined that our armed forces should recognise modern Britain, which is why we are trying to encourage more members from the BAME community to join the armed forces, and equally more women. Currently, I think we're achieving 7.3% in the former and 12.2% in the latter. But last year, we saw a decent pay increase of some 2.9%, and we continue to invest an awful lot of money in improving the accommodation standards for our armed forces.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all, Mr. Speaker, declare an interest, as my son-in-law will soon be going on active deployment with the reserves. Can I also point out the magnificent contribution of the reserve base in my own constituency in Carlton? Can I ask the Minister a simple question, but a really important question? The reserves are a crucial part of our armed forces personnel, and I know the Minister knows that, but there are real significant problems in recruiting and retaining reserves and integrating them into our armed forces. Can the Minister say a little bit more about what the government are doing about that?
The Honourable Gentleman makes a really important point. It will come as no surprise to him, as a serving reserve now for some 31 years, that I take reserve service very seriously. And I think the absolute key is to make sure that we maintain the offer. And that is one of the reasons why I have imposed a target to ensure that opportunity is there, and we will have at least 5% of our reserve community being given the opportunity to go on operations, as indeed the Right Honourable Gentleman's son is. And it's that offer which is so key.
MacDonald.
Congratulating the Minister in holding his position, I welcome the new team to the front bench. The Minister's boss is, of course, a Scot, and he will tell him that Scots don't take kindly to broken promises by Tory governments. So in the Scottish independence referendum, when a promise was made of 12,500 personnel in Scotland by 2020, at the last count standing south of 10,000, isn't it the case that that will be another broken promise by this Tory government?
Minister! Well, I'm sorry that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't seem to welcome the fact that Scotland will soon be the home of all of our Royal Naval submarine personnel. I'm sorry that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't recognise that there will continue to be an army brigade based in Scotland, and I'm sorry that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't seem to recognise the importance of Lossiemouth and the investment in Lossiemouth as the P8 soon to be based there.
Bambos Charalambos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 6.
Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence routinely monitors the performance of all contractors, including those who provide outsourced services. Performance against contract targets is regularly scrutinised, and officials take appropriate actions when standards are not met.
Bambos Charalambos.
Latest figures show that the Army is currently more than 9% under strength, and that the full-time trade-trained strength is now well below the government's stated target. It beggars belief that Capita still hold the contract for recruitment. So, can the Minister tell me, have the government just given up trying to hold them to account?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for the question, and I think I would refer him to the multiple answers that my colleague has just replied to.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the Honourable Lady to her new post. She's very well deserved indeed. She's a graduate of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. That's where she learned everything, so I'm glad that she's now at the dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the fact that the new Type 31 is to be built in Rosyth. It should be a very good contract indeed. But what evidence does she have, or can she bring forward, that contract will be delivered on time and within budget?
Yes, and for the benefit of those observing our proceedings, so that they're intelligible, I think it ought to be explained that the honourable gentleman who's just asked the question is what might be described as the overlord, or the Gandalf figure who oversees the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, your comments may go to his head. You know that, don't you? I thank my honourable friend for his question, and indeed it's been one of the most exciting things I've had the opportunity to do in this role so far, is to be able to set running the new Type 31 class of general purpose frigate. It will be built in Rosyth under Babcock's guidance, and the contract is just at the moment being drawn through to the final details so that we can hope to get cracking early in the new year.
Nia Griffith.
Well, I welcome again the new Minister to her post. But, Mr. Speaker, a report in the Financial Times today demonstrates that botched public sector outsourcing contracts wasted more than £14 billion worth of taxpayers' money in just the last 3 years, with the MOD found to be the biggest culprit, accounting for £4 billion worth of the extra cost. At a time when our defences are badly in need of investment after 9 years of Tory cuts, will the Minister accept that this government's ideological obsession with outsourcing is failing our armed forces and the taxpayer alike?
I thank the honourable lady for her question, and I have had a chance to look a little at the Reform think tank's paper, and it highlights some issues. I think all of us would agree that sometimes contracts have not always been managed as tightly as possible. I think I would direct her, most importantly, to the outsourcing review which was done by the Cabinet Office, set in place by the former Prime Minister in February of this year, which has been very clear and set some really good guidelines, I think, for all government departments to think more proactively about early market engagement in particular. I think that has been a weakness historically, and actually being much more active in management of contracts going forward, so that where we have great contracts like with Leidos, with a new contract I've just signed with Atos, some really great contracts, we make sure that we are responsible in the governance of those contracts so that we get the best for our money and that those contractors provide the service we need.
David Linden.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, Cabine's success in engaging with potential recruits has been particularly bad, and we see that with some of the bureaucratic aspects of the recruitment process and difficulty with the call centres. Does the Minister think this is really the appropriate way to go forward if we're serious about getting more folk into the armed forces?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the start of his question, but in relation to call centres and capture, I think we have to remember that those who are applying, who are 16 and upwards, live in a digital world. They live on apps. Their world of actually dealing with those systems is very much part of that. The call centre is one part of the whole, and that service ensures that the young people can really ask those questions and get to grips with those initial questions about whether joining the armed forces is for them, and how that follows on from that is something that I think we'd all agree my colleague has spoken at length about this afternoon already. We are making huge progress in making sure that we get the numbers of armed forces we need.
Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to answer 7 and 17. We are committed to supporting the UK defence manufacturing industry. On the 14th of March, this government provided an update to Parliament on our ambitious Defence Prosperity Programme, which includes work to sustain an international, competitive and productive UK defence sector. In 2018, the MOD spent £18.9 billion with UK industry and commerce, directly supporting 115,000 jobs.
I thank the Minister for his response. But last week, the former head of MI6, Sir John Sawers, said that the deal for Cobham being taken over by Advent, the private equity company, should be blocked. The Business Secretary said that there would be guarantees, but we know in the case of GKN and Melrose, those guarantees were worthless. So if the US President can say that the US automotive industry is a concern that should be protected for national security, what sort of protections do we have in place for our industry?
We're grateful.
The honourable member makes a really important point about protecting our sovereign capability, and I take that incredibly seriously as someone who worked previously in Kinetic in the former the UK aerospace sector. The issue with Cobham, Mr. Speaker, is an ongoing matter. It is currently before the relevant department in Whitehall. We have made our internal submissions on that. I therefore cannot comment on that particular issue. It is important we maintain and keep our sovereignty where that is viewed as necessary for our future, but we should also not forget the reason we are the second biggest aerospace exporter in the world is because we take an international consortium attitude towards it.
Jim Cunningham. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the Minister's answer, can he tell us what the future value of contracts are to British companies like JKN and companies like Rolls-Royce? What's the future value? What's the future cost of these contracts?
Well, given we've had a recent increase in our settlement by £2.2 billion, of which a large proportion will go on investing in our capital part of our budget, the future for UK aerospace should be bright and looks bright because, of course, the Type 31 frigate, for example, is going to be made in Rosyth and is going to be delivered by UK yards.
Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Although the bulk of their work in the United Kingdom is civilian, Airbus industries also do some military work, for instance on the A400M transport aircraft. Leaving aside the problems with that aircraft, which are dreadful and multifarious, more importantly, the current chief executive, Guillaume Faury, I think I pronounced that correctly, and his predecessor had both threatened to withdraw up to 14,000 jobs in the United Kingdom if we left without a deal in a disorderly manner. Now that we have a deal and are not planning to leave in a disorderly manner, does the Secretary of State agree that the Chief Executive of Airbus should withdraw that threat and should start talking about investment into the United Kingdom rather than disinvestment?
My right honourable friend raises an interesting point. I think my only advice to chief executives of aerospace companies is I would invest where the skills are and where the customers are, and that is in the United Kingdom.
Although the order for the CVRT replacement, the Ajax tank that was placed with General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin and Rheinmetall, the American and European companies, the hulls are being kitted out in Merthyr Tydfil and the turrets are being built in Bedford. How important does the Secretary of State believe that it is that if we place orders for the best equipment available in the free world, that we should have much UK content as possible?
Where possible, we should encourage and do as much as we can to make sure there is a huge proportion of UK content in all the contracts we deliver, if that is going to be possible, to make sure our forces get the kit they need.
Could I welcome the new ministers to their posts? Mr. Speaker, a little more than 3 months ago, a prominent Conservative member of this House said, and I quote exactly, "We must continue to hammer home the importance of sovereign capability." That was, of course, the new Minister for Defence Procurement before she was promoted. Thinking about the Fleet Solid Support ships, for example, can I ask the Secretary of State why his ministers don't practice what they preach?
The honourable member is tempting me to comment on an ongoing competition, and he would know that if we were to prejudice that competition, both the UK taxpayer and indeed potentially UK industry would be put at risk by being sued by the other consortium. My honourable friend, who I welcome into my team, was of course not the minister at the time of that competition being delivered, so I think to hold her to that account is unfair.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has a... Oh, number 8, sorry.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to answer 8, 10 and 18 together. To help sustain future capabilities, we have published strategies for shipbuilding and combat air and refreshed our defence industrial policy with a new emphasis on supporting growth and competitive, which is central to our procurement programme, such as Type 31 frigate and Tempest.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has a world-beating defence industry that's dependent on high-value design. Can my right honourable friend therefore tell the House how his department is supporting the government's Engineering Take a Closer Look campaign to ensure that people understand how vital engineering is to our defence industry?
Can I congratulate my honourable friend for being appointed the engineering envoy by this government? I think engineering is incredibly important, and that's why we support the Engineering Take a Closer Look campaign to form part of that legacy and focuses on STEM youth engagement, targeting not only young people but also the gatekeepers such as teachers and parents. We're fully supportive of the campaign objectives, Mr. Speaker, to increase consideration of a career in engineering with specific focus on 11 to 16-year-olds, especially among underrepresented groups such as girls and BME.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is the Department taking to ensure key industries maintain sovereign capability?
Secretary of State. In order to make sure that we keep skills and innovation here, the government has been determined to invest in that homegrown innovation, which I think is the best long-term way to sustain UK capability. That's why the Defence and Security Accelerator launched in 2016 is so important, as is the Defence Innovation Fund that amounts to £800 million to be spent in that sector over the next 10 years.
Maria Miller.
Thousands of people across North Hampshire contribute to the defence of our country in companies like Fujitsu, Harris and BAE Systems and their supply chains. Being able to recruit experts from across the world to be able to work with our domestic homegrown talent is an essential part of our winning formula. How will the government make sure that that recruitment can still happen after we leave the EU?
My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has been very clear about a sort of points-based system to make sure that we get the skills we need. But again, the long-term solution is to invest in our skills base, which is why I was very pleased that at the recent spending review, the increase to FE funding is going to be so important to make sure that happens. In my constituency in Lancashire, that is the bedrock of BAE's capability. The investment in schools and higher and FE colleges makes the
Kevin Jones.
Here the Secretary of State reluctant to talk about the fleet salt support contract, but can I ask him what percentage of the bid is actually being taken into consideration in terms of support for UK jobs and manufacturing? And is he really going to be content with being the Secretary of State that is going to export jobs to Spain rather than invest in this country?
I think the right honourable member's last part is anticipating the result of any competition, and I'm not going to comment on who or what is going to win if we progress to that stage with competent bids. Look, it's going to be really important that all the bids coming forward will have an element of UK capability in them. We will make sure we look at that. It's really important to us and to the skills in this country that the customer, that is the MOD, spending all that money, make sure that it achieves not only an export market but also UK-based.
Ruth Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Project Tempest is delivering and investing in a future fast jet programme. However, given what we're hearing about the potential closure of Brough, what conversations is the Secretary of State having with BAE Systems about replacement training jets, and what investment is he planning on making for some new Red Arrows?
Oh dear. Mr. Speaker, I will have to write to you about the Red Arrows. It's not one I was expecting. Look, the Tempest is a very important sign that this government is committed to another generation of fast jet. That's a really important sign to BAE. I will be meeting BAE soon, and I will make sure that their desire to be part of this programme is reflected in where their workforce is around the country.
Get in there.
On the dispatch box made a very significant statement just a while ago when he said that companies should invest where the skills are and where the customers are. But that only applies if the customer's prepared to use their buying power to insist that that manufacturing takes place in the UK. So even before we come out of with Brexit, why won't he actually change government policy and actually insist that the solid ship support vessels are built in British yards? Make a decision, man.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, the two aircraft carriers are built in British yards. The Type 26 is built in British yards. Type 45 is built in British yards. The Offshore Patrol Batch 2 is built in British yards. The Type 31 is built currently in British yards, and we will continue to invest in our yards. But as he heard from the previous member asking the question about how do we make sure BAE continues to invest in its workforce, the reason BAE could continue to invest in workforce because it also managed to export around the world. And when we export, we have to recognise we need international consortium because we cannot just sell purely to ourselves. We have to export around the world.
In there. Yes, Mr. Baker. Secretary of State.
Our armed forces have suffered decades of being hollowed out to meet short-term pressures. Eventually, this takes the toll on the men and women of the armed forces and the equipment and maintenance programme. The recent funding announced in the spending review will allow us to reinvest and maintain our forces at present levels. The adequacy of our capability is of course defined by the extent of our ambitions and whether we as a nation are willing to fund them.
Steve Baker. Grateful, Mr. Speaker, but will he reassure me that nothing in the European Union's coordinated annual review of defence will affect the capability or strength of our armed forces in the short, medium or long term as we leave the European Union?
My honourable friend raises some concerns about the engagement with Europe and indeed Europe's ambition. I think it is absolutely right that the European Commission has a very strong ambition for a single defence capability. We have been very clear that we will only join any part of this European defence voluntarily and on the condition there is a unilateral mechanism to exit. That is the key purpose of it. We will of course work with international partners often to face threats.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Secretary of State wants to assess the strength of the armed forces, in his assessment, doesn't he now agree that it's about time that it had a trade union to stand up for ordinary members of the armed forces against his puny government?
Mr. Speaker, coming from a party who reduced the armed forces to a rubber boat in Scotland, I don't think we should really take any lectures from them. It's absolutely clear the SNP are obsessed with a trade union representation rather than investing in armed forces.
Mary Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 11, sorry.
7. Minister Johnny Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've already met with the Schools Minister on this issue. Critically, we work hard to get the message out there through payslips, posters and an advertisement campaign. We can all, as MPs, play a role in making sure the families of those who serve receive the benefits they're entitled to.
Mr. Speaker, there are over 400 serving armed forces personnel in the Wakefield district that make a huge contribution to our nation's defence. But there are concerns from the Army Families Federation that the pupil premium, the service pupil premium, is not being used properly by schools to improve the pastoral outcomes for service children. What discussions has he had with schools on guidance?
Well, look, I'm very keen that the service pupil premium is used in the way that it's been designed for pastoral care and things like that. If the honourable lady has evidence that that is not taking the place, then I would invite her to write to me and we can look into it.
Edward Vasey. When the Minister next comes to visit the Royal Military College in Shrivenham in my constituency, will he pop into Watchfield Primary School, where he'll see a brilliant primary school, educates children from all over the world, the children of the many nationalities that study at the Military Defence College? And when he gets back, will he ask the Secretary of State why the Ministry of Defence gives no financial help to this primary school in terms of the language teaching it has to do for these children?
Well, look, I pay tribute to the school in question that does a great job of looking after the children of those who come and serve on our CDS in Shrivenham, and I'm more than happy to look into the question he raises.
Danielle Rowley.
13, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Mercer.
17.
13.
Number 13.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer question 13 and 15 together. All service personnel with non-EU citizen dependents are subject to the minimum income requirement when applying for visas to enter the UK. I recently met with my friend, the Minister for Immigration, to discuss the minimum income requirement for visa fees. This is now being taken forward by officials from both departments, and I'm very hopeful of a good outcome.
Danielle Rowley.
Mr. Speaker, Pennycook in Midlothian is home to the Royal Highland Fusiliers at Glencorse Barracks, and the battalion have had a number of serving Commonwealth soldiers, particularly from Fiji, Mr. Speaker. Commonwealth citizens have made significant contributions to the defence of the UK throughout history and continue to do so today. I appreciate the warm words from the Minister and that he's had conversations, but isn't it time that we repay their sacrifice by scrapping the minimum income requirement so they can be reunited with their families?
So I pay tribute to the sacrifice and the service of those from Commonwealth countries over the years, which is exactly why we're looking to recruit more from those parts of the world as it stands at the moment. I am in conversations with the Home Office to try and work out ways that we can get over the minimum income requirement, and lots of options are being looked at, whether we work with credit unions to introduce it at pay slips and things like that. But I'm more than happy to meet with my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much like ordinary civilians, Commonwealth soldiers are being unfairly treated by the government under its hostile environment policies. Is the Minister aware of the significant difficulties Commonwealth personnel have encountered in bringing their family to the UK, and will he engage with me to address these issues?
I'd be delighted to engage with my honourable friend, and I would reiterate again the sacrifice and the service of so many of our Commonwealth soldiers who've contributed so much to the armed forces in this country, make it such a diverse and incredible set of armed forces that do such a good job on our behalf.
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Defence exports will continue to be supported not just by Defence but by other government departments, including the Department for International Trade, after the UK leaves the EU. Work is ongoing to explore how to strengthen the competitiveness of UK industry and support exports, both to the EU and globally. My right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, has regular conversations with the Secretary of State for International Trade, including through the Defence Security and Exports Working Group.
Harriet Baldwin. Can I congratulate my honourable friend on her appointment and note that she is a fervent champion of the tremendous exporters that we have in the defence sector. She will know that they often face non-tariff barriers when they export to the United States. Can she reassure me that she will be championing their cause and making sure that those non-tariff barriers are broken down when we have a new trade deal?
I thank my honourable friend for her kind words, and I would reassure her that through our long-standing bilateral relationship with the US, we work closely across the full spectrum of defence, including on issues of shared economic interests such as reducing barriers. Free trade agreements are not used as a means of increasing defence exports. For non-sensitive and non-warlike defence goods and services, the UK may pursue greater access to US public procurement opportunities through the free trade agreement.
The 13 old nuclear submarines tied up alongside in Devonport not only provide a really important case to generate jobs in Devonport, but also exporting the skills and technology around the world. Will the Minister put forward a proposal and a strategy as to how we're going to recycle these old nuclear submarines within the next year?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his optimism that anything so big as a project as that could be done in a year, but I certainly take up the challenge, as I have been described by some of the department, poacher turned gamekeeper on this particular subject. Especially, I have made it very much a priority of my own to move it forwards. I was visiting the work being done on Resolution, on the Swiftsure project up in Rosyth just a couple of weeks ago, and I've been very encouraged by the progress they're making, and we are starting to really see a structured framework to be able to move this project forwards and move our way right through our elderly and now needing retiring submarines.
Topical questions, Vicky Ford.
Number 1, please.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, in light of recent events at the Syrian border, the government urges all parties to ensure they comply with international law, including international humanitarian law and obligations on human rights. We urge a swift de-escalation to the conflict from all parties.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note that last week changes were made to the political declaration on the future relationship between the EU and the UK. Can my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Defence, confirm that no member of the British Armed Forces would ever be obliged to serve alongside any EU army without the Minister's support?
The Honourable.
My honourable friend makes the key point, which is without the ministerial support or indeed the intention of this government to voluntarily join either an EU task force or indeed a NATO task force or any other type of international task force. I can absolutely reassure her that we will not enter into any of these European schemes without voluntarily doing so and indeed without a unilateral access.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we approach Remembrance Weekend and the launch of the RBL's Poppy campaign, we remember all those who have given their lives for our country and, of course, all the veterans who have served. Many of the veterans have accessed the Veterans Gateway for help and support, but there is significant concern that the future funding is not guaranteed. So can the Minister today address that concern and guarantee the necessary funding for the Veterans Gateway to continue its good work?
So the Veterans Gateway received an initial period of funding. It is supported by a consortium of charities. The Veterans Gateway has been a success in terms of veterans accessing help in this country, but a long-term plan is being devised for it at the moment, and I'm more than happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss that in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the relevant Minister meet with me as a matter of urgency to discuss the interminable delay in agreeing a lease for the East Rig site of MOD Longtown? This delay is causing a threat to important investment and job creation in my constituency.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to meet with the honourable member to discuss the East Rig site in his constituency. I am aware of the aspiration of Rail Sidings Limited to develop their railway rolling stock storage business at MOD East Rigs. DNS continue to manage the site and may support initiatives to commercially exploit the rail infrastructure, provided any increase in use does not conflict with the primary demands of defence.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Can the Secretary of State commit to publishing his department's analysis of leaving the European Union as far as forfeiting our rights and responsibilities of 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty is concerned?
I'll be delighted to write to the honourable member on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the surprise at the speed with which the Americans fled from the scene in Syria, can the Minister tell me what preparations he's making for greater logistical independence for Her Majesty's Armed Forces so they don't feel abandoned?
Minister Lancaster.
Well, the UK remains fully committed to the long-term security of the region and to the counter-Daesh coalition. We continually assess the UK and coalition logistical capability to ensure we are well placed to continue to contribute to the counter-Daesh effort. We remain at the forefront of the coalition's air campaign.
Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just not possible to recognise the sacrifice and the service of our armed forces in pay alone, but it is wrong that the salary of a new recruit is now worth over £1,000 less per year than it was 10 years ago. So what is the Minister going to do, and when will the pay of a new recruit match what it was 10 years ago in real terms?
Mr. Lancaster.
My understanding is that I'm delighted to say that as a result of the recent pay review, actually the starting salary of a private soldier has risen to over £20,000.
Field.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps are being taken to protect veterans who have served in Northern Ireland?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue of protecting our servicemen and women from vexatious and repeated prosecution in Northern Ireland is something this government takes incredibly seriously. Regular meetings are now ongoing between myself, the Attorney General, Secretary of State and Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. We are absolutely committed to the Prime Minister's destination that there will not be any vexatious, repeated allegations and prosecutions without new evidence, and we will achieve that objective.
Yamadenko.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We heard earlier about the failures of Capita on army recruitment and Carillion, of course, on army accommodation. Isn't it time to review the costly procurement process whereby the government just last month signed a £1.6 billion contract to decommission Sellafield to Morgan Sindall, responsible for the Fastlane Leisure Centre supermess?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Sadly, I cannot speak for procurement of other departments, but I can reassure that in my new role, I take how we do procurement, with who, and how we will manage those contracts extremely seriously.
Robinson.
Thank you. In London, some veterans are eligible for free travel under the Veterans Concessionary Travel Scheme. However, in Greater Manchester, our service veterans don't have the benefit of travelling free on public transport all year round. Transport's a devolved power, and after years of service, I believe our veterans should be afforded a gold standard of treatment on our transport network. What discussions have the Minister had with the Mayor of Greater Manchester on this point?
Mercer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've not had any discussions with the Mayor of Greater Manchester on this issue, as transport is devolved to the Greater Manchester Authority. It's for them to decide. However, as a supporter of the Armed Forces Covenant, Transport for Greater Manchester provides free travel on Metrolink for our veterans on important days such as Remembrance Sunday, but I am of course happy to meet the Mayor to discuss this further.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Speaker. I met some veterans from the Far East in the 1950s, and they impressed upon me the gross unfairness of the fact that some of them had served for 15 years. Will the government change the rule that means people who served before 1975 have to have served for 22 years to get a full pension?
So in respect of pensions pre-1975, it's been a long-standing convention that lies with the Treasury, and it is simply, we simply do not have the resources to backdate that previously, as has always been the case with pensions across the public sector.
Mr. Speaker, the recent attack on the Saudi oil facility was carried out using small pilotless drones capable of flying hundreds of miles. Can the Minister tell the House what defence the UK has against such similar attacks?
Minister. Well, within the United Kingdom, the Home Office has responsibility for counter-drone activity. The MOD has a layered air defence capability, and we are happy to allow other departments to use that capability when they specifically request so.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that the Hawk manufacturing at Brough is due to end in 2020 after over 100 years of aircraft manufacture. I thank her for agreeing to meet with me on Wednesday, but ahead of that meeting, please will she consider all suitable BAE MOD contracts and what pressure can be put on BAE to insist that some of those are manufactured in Brough?
I've regularly met the unions from Brough over the years, and not only because I represent a site in Lancashire that also represents BAE workers. The key for BAE is for us to support them getting more export bids and also at the same time invest in the next generation of fighter. And with that, we will make sure that with our money and your taxpayers' money comes a commitment from BAE that the jobs are as much based here throughout the country as they've always been.
For goodwill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend from Chelmsford mentioned cadets in the community, but the Cadet expansion programme is about establishing 500 new cadet units in state schools. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of the value of cadet units for some of our most disadvantaged children in some of our most challenging schools?
Minister. The University of Northampton's research into the social impact of cadet forces, which includes those in state schools, suggests that membership can increase social mobility and help children reach their potential because of the activities they undertake, and this is precisely why this has been such a successful process.
Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware of reports of the use of white phosphorus by Turkey in northern Syria. What is he doing to assist NATO allies in the investigation into this?
The Honourable Lady is right. White phosphorus is only permitted for using as signals and markers. It is not allowed by Geneva Convention to be used as a weapon. A number of people are collecting evidence about that incident and many other incidents. When that evidence is presented either to me or indeed to OPCW or the UN, then I think we will consider together what the next step should be.
Finally, because he mustn't miss out, Ranald J. Wardener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Minister has just said and what the Prime Minister has said repeatedly in March, in July and last week, that we mustn't let politics trump justice. I trust that legislation is coming to stop vexatious prosecutions. But when?
So the department has completed a consultation that closed only last week, brought forward by the previous Secretary of State around enhanced legal protections. We're now collecting those responses and we'll look forward to bring forward a bill in early of the new year.
Order. I wish to make a statement to the House. On Saturday last, at column 658, the Leader of the House rose on a point of order to announce the government's intention to bring forward a motion today under Section 13(1)(b) of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. Unfortunately, the point of order did not prove to be a prelude to an emergency business statement on which colleagues could question, probe and scrutinise the leader. Rather, for approximately an hour, 30 points of order were raised by no fewer than 24 colleagues, with me expressing disquiet and consternation that the government intended to require the House to consider again on Monday the same matter which it had decided 48 hours earlier on the immediately preceding sitting day. It was my privilege to listen and respond to the views of colleagues. I then undertook to reflect further on what members had said and to give a ruling this afternoon, which I shall now do. There are two issues, one of substance and the other of circumstances, to consider. I shall address each in turn. First, I have to judge whether the motion tabled under Section 13(1)(b) of the 2018 Act for debate today is the same in substance as that which was decided on Saturday. Page 397 of Erskine May is clear that such a motion may not be brought forward again during that same session. It is equally clear that adjudication of cases is a matter for the Chair. I invoked Erskine May and ruled on this issue as recently as March the 18th this year. Saturday's motion sought approval for the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration on the future relationship between the EU and the UK, and the declaration concerning the operation of the democratic consent in Northern Ireland provision. Today's motion seeks approval for the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration on the future relationship between the EU and the UK, and the declaration concerning the operation of the democratic consent in Northern Ireland provision. It is clear that the motions are in substance the same. However, this matter was decided fewer than 49 hours ago. After more than 3 hours of debate, the House voted by 322 to 306 for Sir Oliver Letwin's amendment, which stated that, and I quote, "This House has considered the matter but withholds approval unless and until implementing legislation is passed," unquote. The second matter for me to consider was whether there had been any change of circumstances that would justify asking the House to reconsider on Monday what it had decided on Saturday. On the face of it, unless an event or development external to the House had interceded, it is hard to see a significant change of circumstances that would warrant a reconsideration on the next sitting day. In this case, a reconsideration pre-announced by the Leader of the House just under 21 minutes after the result of the division was announced. However, the government might argue, though to date it hasn't put forward any argument or explanation at all, that the change of circumstances is the Prime Minister's application on Saturday night for an extension of Article 50. This is not persuasive. The application is... This is not persuasive. The application is part of a process rather than a significant event in itself. In summary, today's motion is... I'm extraordinarily grateful to the honourable gentleman. If he'd bear stoically and with fortitude, I shall complete my statement. In summary, today's motion is in substance the same as Saturday's motion, and the House has decided the matter. Today's circumstances are in substance the same as Saturday's circumstances. My ruling is therefore that the motion will not be debated today, as it would be repetitive and disorderly to do so. For the the benefit of colleagues not closely familiar with the so-called Same Question Convention, which is very strong and dates back to 1604, I will summarise the rationale for it in a sentence. It is a necessary rule to ensure the sensible use of the House's time and proper respect for the decisions that it takes. If it is not legitimate for the motion to be taken today, what is it legitimate for the government to do? The answer is that, as the Prime Minister himself signalled in his point of order on Saturday at column 653 and in his letter to members that evening, the government can introduce its EU withdrawal and implementation bill. Indeed, it has done just that, presenting the bill for its first reading today. I have no doubt that the leader will offer further details of the intended timetable for the bill when he makes a business statement later today. Meanwhile, I hope that this ruling and explanation are helpful to the House. Order. Point of order, sir. Yes, point of order, Mr. Peterborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entirely follow the logic of your argument. But what weight did you give to the point that when we were debating on Saturday, nobody knew whether the Prime Minister was going to send a letter or not? And since that has happened, whilst you are quite correct, sir, to say the motion is the same, an event outside has dramatically changed it. And given that the motion on Saturday is very clear that final approval can't be done until the deal has gone through in legislation, would it not be, as you've always said, to let the House decide on this matter, notwithstanding the fact that the previous motion is clear what actually is going to happen? It would give the country the opportunity to know whether this House approves or disapproves of the Prime Minister's deal.
I'm deeply grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. My response is as follows. I did not consider, in reaching a judgment on this matter, whether a letter would be sent. The letter was sent on Saturday evening. More widely, however, the question of whether it would be a material consideration for the chair whether a Minister of the Crown would obey the law, the honest answer to the honourable gentleman is that that consideration had not entered my mind as pertinent to my reflection on the matter. I note the wider point that the honourable gentleman makes, and I respect the fact that it is a point of view. And I intend no discourtesy to the honourable gentleman when I say that I think I have made the argument for and explained the rationale behind the judgment that I have made. I'm not seeking to rubbish the honourable gentleman. I'm simply making... No, I'm not seeking to rubbish the honourable gentleman. I'm simply making the point that having reflected on all of the considerations and the interests of the House, I have reached the conclusion I have reached. And it is important that colleagues hear all parts of it. And the honourable gentleman didn't like part of it, as is politely explained in his point of order, but he will also have heard me say what is open to the government to do. And the government can introduce its bill, and the government can propose a programme motion for it, and the government can proceed with the support of the House between now and the end of the month, as collectively Parliament prescribes. And that seems to me to be entirely proper. I will come to other colleagues. Yes, I'll come to other... particularly the illustrious chair of the European Scrutiny Committee. But first of all, a point of order, Mr Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As you'll recall, on Saturday afternoon, I was the honourable member who raised the issue that the Leader of the House should have been making an emergency business statement at that time, rather than relying on the device of a point of order to try to change the business today. I described it at the time as low-rent jiggery-pokery. Isn't it time, Mr. Speaker, that the government, instead of playing games with the business of this House, actually subscribe to the usual practices, inform the opposition of their intentions, and indeed inform the Speaker of this House of their intentions in advance, so that we can all get on and with the important business we have to conduct?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. Look, let's focus on the arguments and the issues. As somebody, a very long-serving member of this House, once said, sadly no longer with us, it's not about policies, it's about policies, it's not about personalities. It's not about personalities, it's about policies. And so I don't want to get into the personalities of it. I know that the Leader of the House disapproves of jiggery-pokery, because I've heard him say so in the past. If memory serves me correctly, on March the 26th, 2015, in the Chamber, he made that very point, that he deprecated the use of jiggery-pokery. I don't want to get into that. I suppose what I want to say is this, that our precedents for changes in business being announced on points of order, it's not the norm, but there are precedents, and I don't want to ascribe any improper motive to the Leader of the House, whose personal courtesy to me over the years has been and remains unfailing. I hope I have reciprocated it. He made the judgment he made. There was very little notice that he was going to say what he said, but that was really perhaps a product of the circumstances. The honourable gentleman might think the circumstance could have been anticipated and some advance notice would have been helpful, but we were where we were, and I don't complain about having to respond to points of order. The Leader didn't stay for all the points of order, he stayed for some of them, but I feel certain that he will since have familiarised himself with all of them. We will hear from the Leader of the House later, and I'm sure we look forward to that. Yes, of course, yes. Well, first of all, point of order, Sir William Cash.
I'm most grateful, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order which I made a couple of days ago, I made the point that the law of the land is that set out in Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act 2018, and that quite unequivocally states that the European Communities Act is repealed on exit day, which is the 31st of October. The Ben Act has not done anything yet other than in respect of the letter to change the repeal of the 1972 Act. Therefore, I would simply argue, and I would put it to you, that the question of whether or not, as you mentioned in your statement, there are issues relating to whether or not the law is being obeyed, is not an issue at this stage in the proceedings. For that reason, I simply say to you, if I may, would it be possible for you to reconsider your decision, because I'm afraid that the reality is that the law of the land remains, as I've said last Friday.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman, whose experience in these matters and whose prowess as a lawyer I readily acknowledge. I hope he won't take it amiss, but if he does, it's a regrettable inevitability when I say that the honourable gentleman has put on the record his understanding of the legal position, and he has said it with crystal clarity this afternoon as on previous occasions. Other people have a different view about the legal position and the significance of the so-called Ben Act. If memory serves me correctly, I did not dwell in my statement on adherence to the law. I touched on that matter only in response to the point of order from the honourable gentleman, the member for Wellingborough. I totally understand what the honourable gentleman thinks and why. Moreover, I made clear in the statement the option open to the government, and I reiterated it in response to the honourable member for Wellingborough. The amendment, I remind not just members but those attending our proceedings, in the name of Sir Oliver Letwin, explicitly specified that the legislation should come first. Suddenly to have, at the next sitting day, a debate on the same matter upon which an explicit conclusion was reached on Saturday would seem very unusual. And I have made the judgment I have made. Colleagues, I'm stating the obvious, but when you make a judgment on these matters, manifestly, some people, if it's controversial, are pleased, and other people are displeased. That is in the nature of the responsibility. I have simply sought to discharge my obligations and to do what I believe to be right, and that is what the Speaker has to do. Yes, point of order, Angela Regal. Of course I'll come to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My point of order is about the nature of this power in the chair to prevent Parliament being asked to vote again and again and again on the same thing. Surely this is to prevent an over-powerful executive attempting to demand,
The Honourable Gentleman, I can't quite read his lips, but I think he's saying if only. Yes. I think he's saying if only. But the Honourable Lady must be heard. Angela Regal.
Speaker, it's an attempt to prevent an executive from browbeating Parliament and making certain that it votes again and again and again on the same thing until it gets it right. Now, surely, Mr. Speaker, this is an important defence of freedom in our democracy. And does he agree with me that when we have a government which is attempting to browbeat Parliament and set up a Parliament versus the people false narrative, that this is even more important?
The short answer to the Honourable Lady is yes. I sought, colleagues, to frame my statement in factual terms, and it was, whether people agree with it or not, closely argued. And I did not go in for adjectival excess on this occasion. It is, however, part of the thinking of the chair that the House should not be continually bombarded with a requirement to consider the same matter over and over and over again. And there are people who are concerned about such a prospect, the possibility of being browbeaten or harassed or intimidated. And in the context of the March the 18th statement that I made to the House, I was very aware of commentary in the public square along the lines of, well, we'll bring it back 26 times if necessary until we get the outcome. And that was a factor in my judgment that a ruling from the chair needed to be given. Absence of Speaker intervention on this matter, on the same question convention, since 1920 or thereabouts, is attributable, colleagues, not to the discontinuation of the convention, but rather to general compliance with it. And it is for the protection of the House. And we also don't want contradictory and conflicting judgments to be reached in very short order. And what could be shorter order than the next sitting day after the last judgment was made? It may not appeal to everybody, but that is the rationale for the perfectly reasonable judgment that I have made. Point of order, Mr. Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rather imagine that if you didn't enjoy being bombarded, you wouldn't enjoy so much sitting in that chair. And I note the dilemmas you face mean that on occasion you will sometimes have to please some and not others, but it is becoming remarkable how often you please one lot and not the other lot. I would also remark, Mr. Speaker, that you have inveighed against most unusual things happening in this House which you did not like. And I would say it is most unusual for a Speaker so often to prevent the government having debated the matters which the government wished to put before the House. And it has also been one of your mantras, Mr. Speaker, that the House should be permitted to express its view, even when it comes to changing the meaning of standing orders. And yet you have denied the opportunity of the House to express its view on this matter, because this motion was never voted on Saturday. No.
Want the honourable gentleman to be heard as he must be, fully and without fear or favour, and then I know he will allow me the courtesy of an uninterrupted response. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Well, because this motion was never voted upon, it ceased to exist. It ceased to exist as soon as it was amended, and I confess, Mr. Speaker, surprised that the reason for my right honourable friend's amendment, my right honourable friend for South Dorset's amendment being tabled, failed to enter your head, because the reason was there was an anxiety that the law was not going to be complied with and the letter would not be sent. So the circumstances have changed in that respect. And can I just alert you and the House, Mr. Speaker, to the fact that my committee will be holding a hearing on the role of the Speaker. It has to be said, somewhat in the light of the experience of recent months.
First of all, let me say I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his multifaceted point of order, and it was multifaceted. There were several features to it, and that's important. Secondly, I say to the honourable gentleman that I hear what he says about his committee conducting an inquiry into the role of the Speaker, and that's absolutely proper, and I think he said something from a sedentary position about tomorrow and evidence being taken and witnesses being heard, and that's absolutely right. I don't know what he expects me to deduce from that. I wouldn't dream of seeking to comment adversely, still less to trespass, which it would be quite improper to seek to do, upon the legitimate autonomy of any select committee of this House. And it's perfectly proper for his committee to do that. I'm entirely untroubled by it, and it's a reflection of his conscientiousness that he should undertake such an inquiry. Thirdly, what I say to the honourable gentleman, and there are people in this chamber who know very well the truth of what I say to the honourable gentleman, with respect to how unfortunate that one side seems to be disadvantaged by judgments from the chair. Let me say to the honourable gentleman, I haven't got off the top of my head a count of the number of times that I have granted in the past urgent questions and, in some cases, though they were less fashionable at the time, emergency debates to people of what was then called a Eurosceptic disposition and would now be called a Brexiteer disposition. And the honourable gentleman was one of them. And when I was granting the honourable gentleman and some of his honourable and right honourable friends the opportunity to challenge, to question, to probe, to scrutinise, in some cases to expose what they thought were the errors of omission or commission of the government of the day, I don't recall the honourable gentleman complaining that I was giving him too many opportunities to make his point, and it wasn't a fair use of the House's time, and it was very unfair on his party, and it was a violation of the rights of his government. Now, it may be that sotto voce he was somehow making this point, but if so, I didn't hear it. And I remind the honourable gentleman additionally, and I think fourthly, that yes, and I will make the point because it's an important point to make, that his honourable friend, the member for Basildon and Billericay, tabled an amendment to the Queen's speech in 2013 on the case for a referendum on UK membership of the European Union, a most unusual, though perfectly proper thing for a government backbencher to do. And I selected that amendment, and I did so because I thought that it was well supported and there was a compelling case for it to be considered. So what I'm saying to the honourable gentleman is that when he was getting the decisions in his favour. He wasn't grumbling. He's grumbling now because he doesn't like the judgment. But the judgment I've made is an honourable and fair one, and I'm afraid if the honourable gentleman doesn't like it, there's not much I can do about that. I'm trying to do the right thing for the House as a whole. And my last point, yes, my last point to the honourable gentleman is this, and it's very important not just for members or even particularly for members in the House, but for those observing our proceedings. Nothing in what I have said in any way impinges upon the opportunity for the government to secure approval of its deal and the passage of the appropriate legislation by the end of the month. If the government have got the numbers, the government can have their way, and it's not for the Speaker to interfere. The judgment I've made is about the importance of upholding a very long-standing and overwhelmingly observed convention of this House. That is what I've done, and I make absolutely no apology for it whatsoever. Point of order, Caroline Flint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm seeking clarification on the implications of the Benn Act to the proceedings over the next week or so, and I'm happy to put it in writing if that's helpful, and I'm sorry for not having done so already. The Benn Act, as the Speaker knows, was amended by the amendment put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Aberavon. And if you recall in the debate, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the member for Birkenhead, asked my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, why there was no purpose to his bill, to which the latter Member of Parliament said, we don't want a purpose on this bill, and the implication was to keep it open-ended. Clearly, the amendment that then was then passed by this House included the amendment by my honourable friend, the member for Aberavon, which stated very clearly that there could be no extension beyond the 31st of October unless it was to secure a deal. So could I have maybe some clarification from the Speaker, or maybe in writing tomorrow, that when amendments come forward over the next few days or the next few weeks, only amendments that are pertinent to securing the deal in relation to the essence of that deal, rather than revoking Article 50 or have a second referendum, will be the ones that will be taken, because it is all about securing the deal.
To the right honourable lady is twofold. First of all, it's not for the chair to interpret the Act. People will make their own assessment of that. That doesn't fall to me. Secondly, if the right honourable lady wishes to engage with me on that matter in correspondence, I'm not promising to come back to her tomorrow. I will study any letter from her and respond in as timely a way as I can, compatible with a substantive response being provided, and I should be very delighted to try to oblige the right honourable lady in that regard. Yes. Yes, of course. Point of order, Mr. Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, would it not be better to save consideration of these matters until the business statement so that we can hear from the Leader of the House of Commons?
That's perfectly possible. For that to be the case, a self-denying ordinance is required on the part of people who otherwise wish to raise points of order with me. But I note what the honourable gentleman has said, and colleagues either will be guided by him or not, as the case may be. Point of order, Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, could I make a helpful suggestion that you send a photocopy of Erskine May to members of the government? But on a more serious point, well, it's true.
I want a second vote.
That the government keeps insisting that members of this House should have the opportunity to change their mind. Isn't it time they extended the same courtesy to the British people?
Yeah. Well, I note what the honourable lady has said. The second point is a political one, to which I won't respond. In relation to Erskine May, it is available free online. In relation to the Same Question Convention, I simply make the point that when I pronounced on the Same Question Convention on the 18th of March, one of the early responses came from an honourable member who said, "May I say how delighted I am that you have decided to follow precedent, which is something I am greatly in favour of." And he went on to make other supporting points. The person who responded in that way was none other than the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for North East Somerset, the Leader of the House. So the Leader of the House was very much with me at that time on the same question convention. I take the same view 7 months later, and it is for him to explain whether he does. Point of order, Sir Desmond Sway.
However unfashionable it might be, Mr. Speaker, I believe you're quite right. And by the same token, it's quite wrong to expect the voters to have to answer the same question a second time.
Look, I've known the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for New Forest West for 22 years. I like him so much that I don't want to ruin a burgeoning political career, as he's only probably a quarter of the way through his. But one of the great merits of the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for New Forest West is that he is a model of consistency, principle, and fair-mindedness. Point of order, Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The meaningful vote process was a process which Parliament insisted that the government adhere to. And all the government are trying to do is to stick to a process set out by Parliament. And clearly, on Saturday, things were amended. Now we can have a clean vote, because I think there is an appetite among the country, if not this Parliament. I mean, they're not exactly empty benches here to try and get a view on what the Prime Minister's deal is about. The fact of the matter is, I agree with Sir Desmond Swain. I think your ruling is probably right, except that we are prone, unlike most of Erskine May, to the EU Constitution. And the EU Constitution means at the moment we leave at the end of this month, which means there's limited time. So we're going to be treated to the spectacle of empty benches in this House as we go home at some point, and maybe sitting late or sitting at weekends in order to try and get government legislation on the statute book. And I'm not sure the British people will understand that.
Well, just say to the Honourable Gentleman, and I genuinely apologise to him if I have misunderstood any part of his point, but I am reacting on the hoof. Whether there were the debate today or not, the government requires the passage of the requisite legislation. Therefore, insofar as the Right Honourable Gentleman is concerned about the time required for the legislation, the programme motion for it, the sitting hours entailed by it, the inconvenience that might flow from it, those considerations would apply whether we had the debate today or not. The issue is, do we make a pragmatic judgment and allow for the breach of a long-standing convention, or do we make a principled judgment? And I have made a principled judgment, and there is every opportunity for the government, with the support of the House, not only to have its say, but to get its way by the end of October. And I don't think I need to add anything to that. It is dependent on parliamentary opinion. I will come to the Honourable Lady. Point of order, Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But before you reflect on it, I acknowledge we have known each other for over 30 years, and in many ways our personal political lives seem to have gone off in very different directions in the course of that time. And I acknowledge the kind remarks you made to me on another occasion outside this House last week. But I am one of the members who has formally recorded my anxiety about your partiality in the chair, and I think the right way to do that is to do it formally. But having done that, like my honourable friend for New Forest West, and having noted the narrow terms in which you gave your ruling today, I think those terms are reasonable in you coming to your judgment. However, is a sufficient change of circumstances us knowing what the response to the letter imposed upon the government by this House to request an extension, then for you to reconsider the conclusions you came to today?
As the honourable gentleman will know, repetition is not a novel phenomenon in the House of Commons, including when perpetrated by me. I have made the point often, and forgive me, but I make it again, that I tend to subscribe to the dictum of the late Lord Whitelaw in these matters. He famously used to say, personally, I think it is better to cross bridges only when I come to them. It's a hypothetical question. I would have to reflect on it and make a judgment in the circumstances of the time. I don't want to fall out with the honourable gentleman, and I appreciate his courteous opening remarks. He won't be surprised to know, though I absolutely defend his right to his opinion, that I don't accept his characterisation of my speakership. I have tried to do the right thing by Parliament. Sometimes people like it when it goes their way, and sometimes they don't when it doesn't. But that is my honest approach. If he disapproves of it, I am sorry about that, because I've known him a long time, but I will live with that. And I don't mean that in any discourteous or patronising way. I will live with that. It is one verdict, and there will be others. But I've made the judgment I've made, and let's wait and see how events develop. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a genuine point of order. And my understanding of Erskine May is that the repeat question applies to a session of Parliament. So the fact that we've had a prorogation since the 29th of March might mean that the government, I'm not saying they would want to do this, they could bring back the same question as they asked the House on the 29th of March. And secondly, would they be able to ask a variant of the motion on the order paper today that included subsections 1 and 3, for example?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable lady, and it is a genuine point of order, and my response to it is as follows. First, when I referred, and I don't mean this impolitely, not to the 29th of March, but to the 18th of March, I was not referring to a motion on that day, which was indeed in the last session. I was referring to the statement or ruling that I gave at the time on the same question convention. The ruling on the same question convention has not just survived from one session to another, it has in fact survived for the last 415 years. So I don't think we need trouble ourselves unduly on that matter. Secondly, I very specifically was making the point that the matter has been treated of as recently as Saturday, with a very clear decision reached by the House on the amendment to the motion, and therefore it would not be appropriate to consider that matter today. Thirdly, when she inquires about whether a different formulation of words or section or subsection would render it open, such a motion, to a different judgment on the same question convention, I hope she'll understand when I say I can't possibly pronounce upon that until I know the circumstances. I would have to see the particulars, and I'm grateful for the rather vigorous nodding of the head of the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Wokingham, who at least on that point seems to agree with me. Point of order, Mr. David T.C. Davis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In citing your ruling just now, you spoke of the importance of precedent and convention. And yet earlier on this year, when you allowed a motion that everyone thought was unamendable to be amended, you said, sir, I'm not in the business of invoking precedent, nor am I under any obligation to do so. If we were guided only by precedent, nothing would ever change. Yeah. Can you understand, sir, in the light of your comments, why some people perceive, perhaps incorrectly, that the only consistency one can find in your rulings is that they always seem to favour one side of the argument and never the government, who are trying their best to carry out the mandate given to them by the British people in 2016?
Well, to the honourable gentleman, and I mean this very sincerely for his point of order, and in particular, in the best traditions of the honourable gentleman's parliamentary service, for his explicit, direct challenge. I respect that. No whispering behind his hands or muttering into his soup or anything like that. He's challenging me directly. I don't agree with him. I think the consistent thread is that I try to do what I think is right by the House of Commons, including by, in many cases, minorities whose voices need to be heard. What I said when I allowed the amendment in the name of the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Beaconsfield, on, if memory serves me correctly, the 9th of January this year, was that the will of the House should be tested. It may well be that it had not been the norm for such motions to be amended, but I felt the circumstances were different. Very specifically, I sensed that there was a very strong appetite for that amendment amongst several parties in the House and a resistance to it by a very much smaller number of parties. And I thought the will of the House should be tested. It is true that we are guided not only by precedent, but what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that just because we're not guided only by precedent doesn't mean that we're not guided at all by precedent. What one has to do is to make a balanced judgment about what best serves the interests of the House. And all I would say to the honourable gentleman is that as recently as Saturday, at the insistence of the government, and I think with the support of the House met on Saturday to deliberate on this very matter. Simply to allow the matter to be reconsidered 2 days later and the very next sitting day seems to me to be entirely unreasonable. And nothing that I have said by way of conclusion today flies in the face of contrary expert advice that I have received. I have consulted, I have taken advice, I have listened to people expert in these matters, and I have not been counselled that what I have said today is wrong. I have not been counselled that what I have said today is wrong. And I have a very strong sense that there is a pretty wide acceptance that on this matter, my judgment, however inconvenient and irksome to some people, has the advantage of being procedurally right. Point of order, Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respect your judgment, and I share your love of precedent, but given what you have said, and given that there have already been a number of votes in this House for a second referendum and voted against, will you apply the same precedent about having repetitive votes when you consider in your deliberations if amendments are put forward for a second referendum?
To the honourable gentleman for what he said, and the principle that I have enunciated has wider application. We are in a new session. The same question convention applies to consideration of the same matter in the same session. I very gently say to the right honourable gentleman that we are in a new session, a point that is in fact so blindingly obvious that I'm sure it won't have escaped the right honourable gentleman, who's a very clever fellow, for a moment. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Some of my constituents have written to me today concerned that the reason that the vote has not been allowed is because the result would go in the government's favour. Now, I'm sure that I've heard that you've given reason for it. But on Saturday, the amendment was brought forward by a right honourable member, member for West Dorset. He has said himself that were the bill to be brought forward, the vote to be brought forward now, that he would not amend it again, and that he would support the government's legislation to come forward. So is there not a sign that actually something has changed since Saturday?
The answer to that, I don't recall every single word that the right honourable gentleman member for West Dorset has said, though I am familiar with the thrust of his argumentation on these matters. It is a matter of record that the right honourable gentleman member for West Dorset has voted for the withdrawal agreement 3 times, and it is a matter of record that he has expressed support for the government's latest deal with the European Union, causing him therefore to be inclined to vote for the legislation. The right honourable gentleman can vote for the legislation if he wishes, and I have every expectation on the strength of what he said that he will do so. But the right honourable gentleman doesn't determine what the judgment is about the same question convention. I mean, he could if he were the Speaker of the House, and if the honourable lady is going to make a belated attempt to persuade the right honourable gentleman to abandon his retirement plans and to seek election to the chair, she may have success with him or she may not. I don't know. He doesn't seem to be offering me any encouragement in that matter. But I've made the judgment I've made, and I think it's the right judgment to make. Point of order, Mr. Geraint Davis.
Point of order. Her Majesty the Queen thought she had
5 weeks to write her Queen's speech, and then she was just given a few days, and she's waiting intently to know what the response of the House is on the Queen's speech. But instead, the Leader of the House has put down a motion which is basically a copycat of the motion on Saturday in breach of Erskine-May, and predictably, I've got to say, Mr. Speaker, you ruled it out of order. Isn't this a discourtesy to Her Majesty and reason that the Leader should reconsider his position for his own incompetence?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, but I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. I certainly am not accusing the Leader of discourtesy. I'm not doing so at all. In fact, I celebrated his unfailing courtesy to me, and I think he will acknowledge mine to him. We are going to hear from the Leader of the House with the business statement, and if the honourable gentleman wants to question the Leader of the House on that business statement and to express his indignation, I very much doubt any force on earth will stop him doing so. If that exhausts the appetite for now of colleagues to raise points of order, and I'm very grateful to colleagues for what they've said and for the courtesy with which they've expressed themselves, whether they agree with my ruling or not. We come now to the first of our urgent questions. Urgent question, the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask an urgent question, namely to ask the Prime Minister to make a statement on the publication of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill and his letter of the 19th of October to the European Council seeking an extension to the period provided under Article 50.
The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary Stephen Barclay.
Mr. Speaker, notice of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill was given to the House on Saturday. The bill was handed to the House yesterday as agreed with the House authorities. It will be introduced for first reading at the start of main business today. The publication of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill is therefore now being delayed by the Leader of the Opposition because he has tabled an urgent question requesting the publication of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Genius. The Withdrawal Agreement Bill cannot, Mr. Speaker, be finalised until the European Council on Thursday the 17th of October, and then follows a historic meeting of this House on Saturday the 19th of October. It has then been introduced on the following sitting day, and as you said just a moment ago, Mr. Speaker, in response to a point of order, what could be shorter than the next sitting day? The sooner this urgent question and the next urgent question are concluded, the sooner it will be available to members. In respect to the Prime Minister's letter to President Tusk of the 19th of October, this was sent in compliance with Section 1 of the Benn Act. The President of the European Council has accepted the request as valid and indicated he is considering it and consulting with Member States.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do admire the Secretary of State for keeping a straight face while he gave that answer. And I'm very grateful to this. I'm very grateful to this urgent question being granted, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has not deigned to grace us with his presence today, but I'm reassured, Mr. Speaker, that despite his pledge, he's not to be found anywhere in a ditch. I would, however, like to welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has sent a letter over the weekend to the EU President Donald Tusk to comply with the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act. Mr. Speaker, as we've come to expect with this Prime Minister, this has been done with posturing and attempts to distract. But despite having told the British public over and over again he would never do it, the letter has, in fact, been sent. Yeah. The request is not only legally necessary and prevents us crashing out of the EU with no deal, but the extension allows this House the space to scrutinise the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. I want to pay tribute to all those members who have worked hard to ensure a no-deal Brexit is ruled out, and I will continue to work across the House to ensure that this continues to be the case. Mr. Speaker, the European Commission has confirmed today that Brussels is now considering the terms of an extension. Can the Secretary of State tell the House when he expects any extension to be granted? And can he categorically rule out the absolutely ridiculous reports yesterday that Conservative MPs are trying to amend the law to jail members of Parliament alleged to have colluded with foreign powers? Does he, like me, fear that for the honourable member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, who is telling everyone who will listen that he is trying to collude with the Polish and Hungarian governments to veto any possibility of Article 50 extensions? Mr. Speaker, this type of nonsense is doing nobody any good at all. If the Prime Minister wants to get his deal through, he should bring forward the withdrawal agreement bill for scrutiny. Will he also bring forward an economic impact assessment?
Yes, that would be good.
Which has so far not seen the light of day. And will he allow this House ample time to scrutinise what this deal means to the communities that we all represent?
Well, I can tell the House what has been ditched, and it is the Honourable Gentleman's manifesto, which he has ditched from the commitment he gave to respect the referendum result to one which is now characterised by dither and delay. He says that he questions the letter from the Prime Minister. What the Prime Minister made clear is that we would abide by the law. And what Lord Pannick has confirmed, amongst many others, is that the Prime Minister has done so. So there is no question as to the commitment from the Prime Minister, but of course he disagrees with the action, and it won't surprise any members either of this House or of the European Council as to what the position of the Prime Minister is and his commitment to leaving on the 31st of October. The Honourable Gentleman talks about collusion. We in this House, Mr. Speaker, want to collude with the British public to respect the referendum result and to get Brexit done. And when he talks about delay, he should answer this question. If he wants a second referendum, we know the Shadow Brexit Secretary wants a second referendum, but if he wants a second referendum, how long is that going to take? How long will the primary legislation take? How long will the Electoral Commission requirements take? How long is he going to leave the House in purgatory? He gave a commitment that if we went past the 31st of October, there would be a general election. And yet on the Moore programme on Sunday, the Shadow Brexit Secretary said he wanted further delay in order to have a second referendum. So when is he going to accept the Prime Minister's challenge? When is he going to have a general election? Or are we going to have, as the Shadow Brexit Secretary said, more dither, more delay and more shirking of his responsibilities?
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, could my right honourable friend try to ensure the government stops giving this sort of sacred quality to the date of October the 31st, which is a really rather silly point, which has intruded into the extremely complicated arguments we're having on this whole issue, although I personally would be quite happy if we could conclude a withdrawal agreement along the lines the Prime Minister is proposing by 31st of October, if we could do it properly. But the date was not selected by the British public or the British government. It was a compromise in the EU between President Macron and the rest, and was plucked out of the air. So will he agree with me that what matters is we get the right withdrawal agreement, carried with the tenuous majority the government may have, through second reading and third reading, so its form is actually settled, and then we can proceed in a way which future generations, if we get it right or if we get it wrong, will regard as much more important than whether we actually made it for a particular day in October 2019.
But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is the date was set by the previous European Council, and it is not a unilateral decision for the UK Parliament as to whether that date is changed. Now, previously in this House, the Father of the House has said what mattered was avoiding no deal. the Prime Minister has secured a deal that does that. So what matters now is that we end the uncertainty for businesses, the uncertainty for citizens, and actually deliver on the deal the Prime Minister has negotiated, one agreed by the EU 27 as well, and we get Brexit done.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I congratulate the Leader of the Opposition for lodging this question. But of course, it's a question to the Prime Minister. And it's a question about the Prime Minister's behaviour. Where is he? Where is the respect that the Prime Minister is showing to this House? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is utterly humiliated by his defeat on Saturday. A defeat that saw this House reject his unfair anti-democratic deal. A defeat, Mr. Speaker, that has forced the Prime Minister to send a letter to the European Union Council requesting a deal. But what did the Prime Minister do? He sent a letter, not on headed paper, and unsigned.
Pathetic.
Can I ask if the Prime Minister is used to sending unsigned letters in his capacity as Prime Minister, and if so, how many? And I want a direct answer to that question.
Anonymous letters.
But I think we know the answer. Because his behaviour lacks dignity. It lacks respect. It is not becoming of any Prime Minister. Once again, the Prime Minister has shown himself to be unworthy of the office he holds. Mr. Speaker, I have with me a copy of a joint letter sent from the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales to President Tusk. Properly addressed, with their official letterheads, and duly signed. The Prime Minister should take note. That is a lesson on how to behave. Because his actions don't just show disrespect to this House, but to the court in Scotland, but to President Tusk himself. Despite the Prime Minister's childish games of sending a contrary letter, of course, the SNP is pleased to see that the grown-ups in room, namely the European Council, are now considering the extension. An extension that must be secured to protect our interests from the economic oblivion if we were to exit the European Union on a no-deal Brexit. Mr. Speaker, I join with the Leader of the Opposition to express the SNP's outrage that the Prime Minister has instructed his government to publish the withdrawal bill without securing adequate time for parliamentary debate and scrutiny. Once again, this Conservative government is showing disregard for democracy. It is absolutely imperative that representatives here are able to do our jobs and scrutinise the legislation given the magnitude of the implications. So I say to the Prime Minister, through the Secretary that's here, if he's not afraid of democratic debate, secure the extension and let's give the time for full scrutiny of the bill. And let me ask this, if he's so sure that the people are with him, will he confirm today that he will seek support for this bill from the Scottish Parliament, who must give consent first?
Well, the crux of the issue is the Prime Minister has complied with the law. But it is right that alongside that he sets out his well-known views, and that should not come as a surprise to the right honourable gentleman any more than it should to any other member of this House. But what is unworthy, Mr. Speaker, is to have referendums and to ignore the result. Which is a position of the right honourable gentleman, not just in terms of the referendum in 2014, but also in terms of the referendum in 2016. After more than 1,200 days since the referendum, the one thing I don't think this House has lacked is opportunity to debate the issues contained in the withdrawal agreement bill. And the withdrawal bill will be published, it is with the House, in order for that debate to happen. So it's time for the House to get on to that debate, to back the bill, to get Brexit done, and to get on to the domestic priorities, the record investment in our health service, the extra 20,000 police officers that we're recruiting, and levelling up all parts of the United Kingdom as part of a strong economic delivery.
Sir John Redwood.
I'm glad the government wishes to base our future relationship with the EU on comprehensive free trade agreement. So will the government get on and table one and show urgency in trying to get one? Because the sooner we can get one, the more reassuring it will be in Northern Ireland. And the public, who are heartily sick of all this, don't want to waste another 15 months. And Mr. Speaker, may I personally thank you for avoiding Groundhog Day today. I heard all the arguments on Saturday. I don't think I need to hear them again.
Yeah. Well, I agree with my right honourable friend. We need to get on to the future relationship. The House has been debating endlessly the winding down provisions, which is what is contained in the withdrawal agreement bill. And what the political declaration sets out is a clear framework for a best-in-class free trade agreement, and we need to pass the bill in order to get on to doing that.
Joe Swinson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was withering in his criticism of the first Brexit deal, and yet he voted for it. He said that no Conservative PM should ever accept a border down the Irish Sea, and yet he has. And he said he would never ask for an extension of Article 50, and yet he sent the letter doing just that. If the Prime Minister is allowed to change his mind, surely the government should give the public the opportunity to do the same by putting their Brexit deal to a people's vote.
I think it's somewhat ironic to have a question about changing minds from the Liberal Democrats, who were the first party to call for an in-out referendum and who now want a people's vote on the basis of ignoring the people's vote that we've had.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The urgent question was introduced by the Leader of the Opposition, which is somewhat unusual. May I refer my right honourable friend to a bill which was introduced in 1997 in the name of the Leader of the Opposition with the Right Honourable Tony Benn, which says that the sections 2 and 3 of the European Communities Act 1972 are hereby repealed, that the European Court of Justice shall have no effect in the United Kingdom, and would he also recall the number of times, which is, as far as I'm concerned, was indefinite, when the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition went through the lobby with me on every single occasion relating to European matters? Does he accept that this really does demonstrate a monumental, not only a mere U-turn, but a monumental degree of lack of memory and a lack of understanding of what the withdrawal bill is all about and the referendum itself?
Well, my right honourable friend has always stuck to his principles. The reality is the Leader of the Opposition cannot even stick to his own manifesto.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't the Brexit Secretary agree with me that the Prime Minister has a problem with veracity? He told us that he would rather be dead in a ditch than sign the letter and sign the letter. He told us that there would be no border in the Irish Sea, and then he negotiated a border in the Irish Sea. Why on earth should we ever believe a single thing that this Prime Minister says?
Well, the Prime Minister didn't sign the letter, so I think the issue with veracity was actually in the question.
Mr. John Whittingdale.
Would my right friend agree that what the recipients of the letter and other EU member states, and indeed the country, want to know is whether or not the agreement that they have reached with the Prime Minister commands the majority support of this House? And how does he propose to explain to them that now, on a second day of the House of Commons meeting, we are still unable to discover that?
Very much share my right honourable friend's frustration. That exactly is the question that will be posed in capitals. They have reached a deal with the government. They want to see the UK leave in a smooth and orderly way. That is what their citizens want to see, is what UK citizens in Europe want to happen, and the sooner we get on and do it, the better.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's reported that the Secretary of State this morning told the House of Lords Select Committee that under this agreement, goods leaving Northern Ireland for the rest of the United Kingdom will require an exit summary declaration to be submitted. Can he confirm for the House that such declarations have to be made when goods leave the customs territory of the European Union? If so, how does that square with Article 4 of the Protocol, which says that Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom? It's either part of the European Union or the United Kingdom. It can't be both.
Well, what I was referring to in those remarks was in line with international obligations. Some practical information will be needed to be provided electronically on the movement of goods from west to east. However, the government will be considering the process during the implementation period.
Craig McKinley. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just say on the floor of this House now, I have zero and absolutely no respect for the Ben Surrender Act. I have no respect by the means by which it was brought to the House and the order paper was taken over. I have no respect that it had 4 hours debate with 1 day's notice. I have no respect. Now, Mr. Speaker, you were not in the chair that afternoon, but the manner in which manuscript amendments were being debated before they're available, this was a shambolic act brought by those who do not want to respect Brexit. The government should be in control of the order paper, and if others don't want that, they can lay a vote of no confidence that they will not do. I really wonder, Mr. Speaker, what is this urgent question for? Is it an argument that somehow the government should have delivered a letter that was gold-trimmed on a sort of a sequined velvet cushion to the Commission? Can the Secretary of State confirm that the letter has obviously been treated as genuine and is being dealt with in the appropriate way by the Council of Ministers, much as I would have preferred that the government and the Prime Minister had ignored this shambolic Ben Act?
Well, the Ben legislation, as he well knows, was designed to prevent a no-deal exit. The Prime Minister was told that changing the backstop was impossible. He delivered it. He was told the withdrawal agreement text couldn't be changed. He did so. We now have a deal that the House can pass. I hope members across the House will do so with the withdrawal agreement bill in order that we can leave on the 31st of October, as citizens and businesses around the country want us to do, and to get on with it.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the Minister realises that I could never get angry with him. He's always been, he and I have always had very good relationships, and I trust him a very long way. But can I ask you, can I beg him to talk to the Prime Minister about this whole sort of, it's almost a philosophy of get on with it. You know, we must get this done, get on with it. Would he agree with me? It's our sacred duty, not just to get on with it, to make sure what the deal is, the quality of it, actually serves our constituents, because they depend on us for their health, their welfare, their future, their prosperity. So we must take this business seriously and slowly. Get on with it is a nasty jibe. Stop it.
Well, firstly, can I thank the honourable gentleman for the kind words with which he prefaced his question, and I very much have always enjoyed working with him on that basis. In terms of the detail, he's right. We do need to get that detail right. But we also need to be clear as to what the scope of the withdrawal agreement bill is. It is to implement the deal, the international treaty that has been reached. It is not to determine the future relationship, which the House, through the withdrawal agreement bill, will have a lot of opportunity in terms of the negotiation mandate to discuss and get right. So we need to implement the treaty. We need to do that through what has been agreed with the EU in the form of the withdrawal agreement bill, and then get on to the debates which I look forward to having with him on the terms of the free trade agreement as we move forward with that deal.
Ben Bradley.
One of my honourable friends shares my concern that two members of opposition front bench parties now have said it's not good enough simply to police the Prime Minister's actions through the courts. They now also want to police his thoughts and opinions as well. I think that's quite a sinister preview of what life might be like under a Labour government if it were to happen. Can he confirm my understanding of the process for the following week and the legislation, and perhaps for my constituents' clarity, that if members opposite bring forward amendments that are not compatible with the agreement that we've made with the European Union, all that will achieve is not to have the outcome of those amendments, it will just frustrate and prevent us from passing a deal and leaving on time.
Well, on the detail in terms of the next steps, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, will make a business statement after the urgent questions, and I would not want to preempt that. But on the wider point, he's absolutely right. The Prime Minister has met his legal obligation. That has been recognised by the President of the European Court, the European Union. And what we now need to do is implement the withdrawal agreement bill, get Brexit done, and get on to the free trade agreement, which the honourable gentleman referred to earlier.
Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the fact that despite all the malarkey and green ink letters and spin on Saturday night, the European Union have accepted the request for an extension. But does it concern the Secretary of State that in the court action raised in Scotland, in which I acknowledge the support of Dale Vince, despite the fact that the Prime Minister, the Attorney General and the Advocate General have all assured the court that the Prime Minister will obey the Benn Act and ask the court to dismiss the action, despite those promises and assurances, the court have seen fit to continue the action to make sure that the Prime Minister keeps his promise.
Well, it's not for a Minister of the Crown to comment on any live court proceedings, but to follow the lexicon of the Honourable Lady, what would be malarkey is for claimants to send letters before the publication of the correspondence that address the issue that was sought in the earlier judgment.
Neil O'Brien.
Recently returned to the House after 2 weeks paternity leave following the birth of my thank you very much. Following the birth of my son, my beautiful son Arthur. I've returned to find even better the Prime Minister secured a wonderful Brexit deal, which I look forward to voting.
Name. You want to know the name of the child?
Arthur, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend reassure me that he will now crack on and get the legislation through so that we can get Brexit done and not be still talking about this when Arthur is old enough to drive?
Maybe the first to congratulate the honourable gentleman on the birth of Arthur, and we wish him a long and happy and healthy life. And I had noticed the absence of the honourable gentleman, and it's very good to welcome him back to the chamber. Secretary of State.
Well, there may have been delays in getting Brexit delivered, but I'm delighted that Arthur has been delivered, and I'm sure I speak for the whole House in both offering our congratulations and also wishing Arthur every success for the future. He's absolutely right. I think up and down the country there is huge frustration both amongst our constituents but also with businesses that want an end to the uncertainty, want to see a deal reached, recognise it's in the country's interest to leave in a smooth and orderly way, and see that the Prime Minister has agreed a deal that is brought to the House. It's now for the House to pass the legislation to enable us to move forward and to get on to the other priorities we want to do.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have received thousands of emails since the Prime Minister brought back his deal on Thursday from constituents who are asking me to tell them what the impact of this deal will be on their jobs, livelihoods and future prosperity for the communities in which they live. I'm unable to do so because the government are refusing to publish an economic impact assessment. What is the answer to them? Will GDP go down? Will jobs and unemployment go up? What is the answer?
Well, the answer is to listen to the Bank of England governor, who says that getting this deal passed will be a boost to our economy, because there's a huge amount of investment ready to be released into the economy if we get this deal passed. The voices of business up and down the country want a decision, want the UK to move forward in a smooth and orderly way, and the best way of addressing the concerns of his constituents is to get Brexit done.
Ollie Elphick. Mr. Speaker, at the Dover front line, we have long been ready for any eventuality, deal or no deal, to leave the European Union. But what we now need is certainty, because uncertainty, and it's dragging on, is becoming economically damaging. So has he had any representations from party opposite about how they'll assist with getting on with Brexit, or has he only ever heard, as I have heard, that they simply want to cancel Brexit and defy the British people?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that what we need is certainty, and what the Prime Minister's deal offers is exactly that. And what we have from the benches opposite is more dither, more delay, a desire for a second referendum, and yet no clarity as to how long that second referendum would take.
Ms Leslie.
I understand the Minister's political reasons for the reluctance around the Ben Act, but it is the law of the land, and it's important because I'm worried from what he's said that he seems to give the impression it's only about sending a letter. It's more than that. Section 1, subsection 4 of the Ben Act requires that the Prime Minister, quote, must seek to obtain an extension. So it's not just a matter of sending a letter, it must seek to obtain that extension. And that involves using the Prime Minister's best endeavours, his good faith in trying to. It must. There's a duty on the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, that he must seek to obtain an extension. So, will the Minister acknowledge that the legal duties on the Prime Minister are not simply about sending an unsigned letter?
Well said.
Well, I mean, the reality is this is Parliament's letter, and the Prime Minister has sent Parliament's letter. But he's been clear that he will comply with the law. He has complied with the law. That is reflected in the comments of figures such as Lord Panic. But he is also entitled to express his views, and that's exactly what he's done.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that lots of my constituents in East Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire think that what happened on Saturday was a Westminster bubble, smarty pants little stitch-up to stop us leaving the European Union on October 31st. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? That's exactly what it was. And can I say to him, the reason why October the 31st is so important is because so many people in this country, particularly across the north of England, have figured out what's going on in here. There is an attempt to play for time, to delay, delay and delay, with the one and simple aim, which is to overturn the referendum result that people in here never accepted and never had any intention of accepting.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The House said that it didn't believe the Prime Minister would get a deal. He did get a deal. They said they wanted a meaningful vote. Then when the opportunity is presented to have a meaningful vote, they make it meaningless. It's time for those games to stop, for us to get a deal through, and the opportunity to do so is to support the withdrawal agreement bill that legislates on the deal the Prime Minister has reached.
Catherine McKinnell.
Speaker, the Chancellor has responded to the Treasury Select Committee's request of 3 months ago asking for updated economic analysis of the free trade agreement that the government is pursuing. The Chancellor has acknowledged that the current economic analysis does not correspond with previous analysis produced by the government, but has not indicated any commitment to provide updated economic analysis. He appears to think it's acceptable for MPs to vote blindly on a potential free trade agreement. Either he has something to hide, or he thinks that's an acceptable way for MPs to be left in the dark.
Well, the reality is the House will have lots of opportunities to debate and instruct in terms of the negotiating mandate, how those negotiations are taken forward. I mean, the reality is that any modelling for the future would have to take on board what is the future direction of the Commission under the new leadership. It'd have to consider what actions the UK government would take in response. It'd have to model what would happen elsewhere in the world, for example, in terms of China and the US. So the reality is one can't do a forecast on these things, but it's right that the House will have an opportunity to negotiate these and to discuss these as part of shaping the mandate for the future.
Peter Boone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Leader of the Opposition was slightly wrong in his question when he said the letter takes no deal off the table. That's impossible, because it's up to the other nations of the European Union whether they grant an extension or not. The only way, sir, you can definitely take no deal off the table is, as someone else once said, is vote for this deal. And that's exactly what this House should do. Does the Secretary of State agree?
I very much agree with my honourable friend, and I'm grateful to him for his support for the deal. And the reality is, as he says, this is Parliament's letter, but any extension would require the agreement of all 27 member states, and that is something that is outside of Parliament's control.
I'm not quite sure from her expression whether the Right Honourable Lady, the member from Maidenhead, is welcoming the Honourable Gentleman's belated support or regretting the fact that it wasn't on offer at a rather earlier stage. Both. Thank you.
Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons why I believe that the government wanted to try and bounce us on Saturday and wanted to bounce us again was actually to hide some of the content and some of the revelations that will come out in the bill, which we will see published shortly. And I think there will be great concerns, not only on this side of the House, but indeed from others who take a very different position from me on Brexit. But I want to take the Secretary of State back to the question that my right honourable friend, who's now not in his place, the chair of the committee, asked about customs declarations, export declarations between Northern Ireland and the UK. Will he confirm that what he said to Lord Wood in the other place was that export declaration paperwork would have to carry out, and therefore, essentially, firms in Northern Ireland will be having to carry out paperwork, and whether digital or otherwise, to trade within their own country, within the United Kingdom? And will he also confirm whether that will apply going back in the opposite direction or not?
As I said in response to the earlier question, I'm very happy to confirm that it is the case that in respect of some international obligations, then there will be occasions where information is needed electronically for the movement of goods, and that is in accordance with international obligations. But the reality is, he talks about bouncing decision making. We've already had 2 extensions. The House has debated these issues endlessly. The withdrawal agreement, the first version of the withdrawal agreement, was published as long ago as last November. The reality is he doesn't want any Brexit. He wants a second referendum. He wants to remain, and he will do everything he can to frustrate Brexit happening.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can we write another letter to the European Union saying that we utterly oppose having a second referendum? And does my right honourable friend not agree that a second referendum is a betrayal of many thousands of Harlow voters who voted to leave and millions of working people across the country? We should respect democracy and implement the result of 2016.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. A second referendum would simply take us back to square one. It would create huge uncertainty, huge delay, and prolong the paralysis of this Parliament when we need a general election and to let the people decide.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to return to the issue of the economic impact assessment, because the effect of all this on manufacturing in my constituency in particular is absolutely critical. So I don't know whether the government are unwilling or unable to release any information they've got on this, but surely the Minister can see how important it is that we have all this information before we make any decisions. After all, he wouldn't buy a house without looking at the deeds, would he?
But the point that is missing is the free trade agreement is still to be negotiated, and what is causing damage to businesses in his constituency and elsewhere is reflected in, for example, the comments of people like Lord Rose, who was a leader of the Remain campaign, who now recognises that what is damaging to business is the ongoing uncertainty. We need to bring that uncertainty to an end, and it is his continued refusal to vote both for a deal whilst also opposing no deal, which is prolonging the uncertainty and damaging the interests of businesses in his constituency.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you stayed tuned to the Andrew Marr show after watching Match of the Day yesterday morning, but if you did, you'd have heard the Right Honourable Member for Esher and Walton say that Parliament cannot muzzle the Prime Minister. He doesn't want an extension. He should be at liberty to tell the EU that. Does my Right Honourable friend agree?
I very much agree. I don't think it will come as a surprise to colleagues in Europe as to what the view of the Prime Minister is. He has been clear from day one that he wanted a deal, despite many voices in this House suggesting otherwise. And he's been clear that it's in the country's interest to leave on the 31st of October. That remains his commitment, and that is exactly what the government is committed to doing.
I think the honourable gentleman was referring to a show at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Yes, I do periodically watch that programme. It isn't sort of top of my list of priorities, but occasionally I will observe it. But I'm bound to say it was a rather greater priority yesterday morning at 9 o'clock to be playing tennis. Very wise. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the unsigned letter the Prime Minister refused even to grace with his name, he sent another letter which he signed in his own name, effectively saying, "Dear Donald, please ignore the first letter I've sent you. I only sent it to comply with an Act of Parliament." If it was not the purpose of that second letter to deliberately attempt to frustrate an Act of this Parliament, what on earth was the second letter for?
Well, as I have said in response to several questions now, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is entitled to express his view. That should not come as a surprise to the honourable gentleman. He has complied with the law. leading legal figures such as Lord Pannick accept that he has complied with the law, but in addition he has set out his view as he's entitled to do.
Which side of that is it now? Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, I hadn't planned standing and just wanted to make a clear point that match of the day every time trumps anything else, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. But I would want to my right honourable friend that can he just explain to me, as it is now finally it appears to be the opposition's position, although I'm never quite clear whether that will change next week, that they want to have a second referendum. Could he then explain to me what could anybody say to the British public when they go out and say, we didn't trust you last time, now you have to trust us that we will trust you again on a second referendum? How could they possibly believe or trust British politicians?
I must tell the right honourable gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green that he shares that penchant with the late and great Anthony Crossland, who greatly enjoyed watching Match of the Day. He would often have colleagues around the dinner table in his home, and they would be discussing political matters. But moments before Match of the Day, Crossland would make it very clear that all further political discussion must cease as he proposed to watch the programme, and he would usually don a bobble hat whilst doing so. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps we could have a similar tradition for the remaining duration of the Rugby World Cup, which I'm sure across the House many members would also enjoy applying that maxim to. My friend is absolutely correct in terms of, well, firstly, the position of the opposition. I appreciate it has moved rather a lot and rather frequently. But if I take the position set out by the Shadow Brexit Secretary on Sunday, it clearly was for a second referendum. And that is odd, given that they don't trust the people with the first referendum. But the question the Leader of the Opposition isn't answering and needs to answer is, how long does he expect the primary legislation to take? How long does he expect the question testing from the Electoral Commission? How long does he expect the operational preparations to take? And how long does he expect the regulated campaign period to be for? Now, if his position is to have a second referendum, we need answers to those questions, because he risks leaving this Parliament in paralysis because he's not answering how long he wants to delay Brexit for.
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify a statement that the Secretary of State made earlier about the Bank of England, they were, of course, comparing the current withdrawal agreement to a no-deal rather than the current economy. But to answer my young constituents, could the Secretary of State say whether he has ever sent a letter that he has not had the courtesy to sign?
No. As I think with all MPs, there are occasions, for example, that I have dictated letters to my parliamentary office, and they have taken as dictated and signed on my behalf.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch fawr iawn, Mr. Speaker. When you mentioned your